We tend to think of borders as lines drawn on a map, physical fences that separate one group of people from another. But the most rigid boundaries you will ever cross have nothing to do with geography. In his track The Barcode 8, rapper Lyrical Joe introduces a different premise, that there are distinctly governed nations residing entirely within humans. Society trains us to define our citizenship by external markers, our bank accounts, our job titles, our zip codes. Joe demands we look inward and examine where our minds actually hold residency. This diagram maps out those internal territories. From the central node of the mind, we partition ourselves into locked states, taking up residence in the nations of imagination, procrastination, and stagnation. If your mental location dictates your daily reality, your physical address hardly matters. The control we think we exercise over the physical world is largely an illusion, dictated by which mental box we've locked ourselves inside. Joe describes a life trapped in these spaces as living in a hallucination, or an illusion. These aren't passive conditions that simply happen to us. They are states of mind we actively, and often unconsciously, choose to inhabit. Becoming a citizen of these mental states carries a heavy tax. You pay it by surrendering your free will to daily mental habits, locking yourself into repetitive, unbreakable cycles. Before a human can meaningfully navigate the physical world, they must first dismantle the cognitive walls they have built around their own consciousness. Watch as these erratic, individual glowing dots collide and lock together into a single massive grid. This is what happens when millions of individual internal nations bleed together into the physical world. Joe scales up his lyrics to address these systemic forces. He shifts from personal stagnation to the macro structures that govern us en masse, pointing out our collective residency in the nations of population, indoctrination, and discrimination. He applies this lens to the wealth divide, noting that the poor stay in bed because at least they'll have a dream. Sleep is utilized as a psychological coping mechanism, a temporary shelter from physical borders that have locked them out economically. He then deconstructs the phrase, "the world is in our pockets," calling different planets currencies. It is a sharp critique of humanity's attempt to commodify existence, trying to buy control over reality. Class hierarchies, global economies, and rigid career paths are all engineered as a false, manufactured shield against the unpredictable nature of reality. But that shield fractures when human ambition grinds against the reality of our actual powerlessness. Joe captures this agonizing tension in one defining question. Why do we think before we act if God wrote the script? On the left is a chaotic web of human ambition. On the right, a single unbending line representing determinism. No matter how we plan, our erratic ambitions crash into the script, instantly absorbed into a single trajectory, rendering legacy building ultimately futile. There is a poetic tragedy in Joe's observation. You build your castle in the air today, but tomorrow you lose your breath. We possess a relentless, exhausting drive to build permanent monuments, entirely ignoring the reality that our time here is strictly, unavoidably finite. This clash between our temporary nature and our desire for control drives humanity toward a manic obsession with one specific concept: forever. This illustration of a brilliant diamond locked inside a decaying iron vault represents how we try to capture eternity. Joe highlights how we use diamonds, marriage contracts, and even lifetime employment to artificially manufacture permanence. But his lyrics begin to unravel linguistically as the logic fails. He realizes, I can live for me, but I can never live forever. Even with a divorce paper, we are bound by time. Human constructs cannot mathematically sustain the burden of infinity. Yet there is a profound mercy hidden inside this limitation. Because forever is impossible for humans, negative earthly experiences, like systemic stagnation and poverty, are also strictly temporary. As Joe points out, poverty is also not forever. Forever is a concept entirely incompatible with the living human experience. We spend our lives chasing a mathematical ghost. Out of all the complex systems, internal borders, and social contracts explored in Joe's philosophy, only two things actually cross the threshold into true forever. As this perfectly still ocean suggests, the first is the absolute end of biological consciousness. In Joe's words, maybe sleep is forever when you die. The second is the divine absolute. After a dizzying search for permanence, the track grounds itself on one final statement: God is forever. Accepting that our time in these internal and external nations is fleeting is not a nihilistic tragedy. It is the ultimate freedom. It releases us from the crushing, impossible pressure of trying to make our temporary lives permanent.